The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the trees that lined the old highway, a road seldom traveled since the new freeway had been built. It was the kind of route one would take only if they were not in a hurry, or if they were trying to avoid attention. Jack Sullivan had both reasons in mind when he chose this path home. The trunk of his aging sedan weighed down with artifacts he had just acquired at a rather obscure auction in the neighboring state. Jack was a collector of the macabre, Victorian mourning jewelry, first edition occult books, even rumored haunted objects. This trip had been particularly successful, a 17th century diary belonging to a supposed witch, and what was allegedly a fragment of a tombstone from the infamous Salem witch trials. As darkness fell, the dim light from his headlights barely penetrated the thick fog rolling in. He knew the stories of the highway, rumors of figures that appeared in the fog, of cars found abandoned with no sign of the drivers, of whispers heard over radios that turned to static. Jack, ever the skeptic, entertained these tales with a sense of ironic amusement. He believed in tangible ghosts, ones that could be touched, sold, and collected. The rest were just stories. Around the 10th mile, the radio began to crackle. Jack frowned, twisting the knob to clear the signal, but instead of his music, a voice emerged, soft and whispering, almost lost beneath the static. "Don't drive alone." Jack chuckled. "Very funny," he muttered, assuming it was just a snippet of a late-night radio show. But the voice continued, growing clearer as he drove deeper into the fog. At night, the temperature dropped, breaths of cold air seeping through the window seals. Jack's amusement faded into a prickling unease. He turned off the radio, the silence of the car now a heavy blanket around him. Then, from the darkness ahead, a figure emerged, a woman, her dress long and pale, her feet bare. Jack slammed on the brakes, heart hammering as the figure seemed to float rather than step to the side of the road. She turned her face toward him, her eyes hollow pools of black, her mouth agape as if frozen in a silent scream. Jack's breath fogged up the windshield, obscuring his view. When he wiped it away, the woman was gone. His heart still racing, he decided that it was time to leave this old road behind. But as he accelerated, the car's headlights flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The engine sputtered and choked before coming to a complete stop. Jack's fingers trembled as he tried the ignition again and again, nothing. He reached for his phone, no signal. Outside, the fog was so thick he could barely see beyond the hood of his car. The stories he had scoffed at now circled his mind like vultures. Jack decided to stay in the vehicle. The safety of its confines seemed a better choice than venturing into the unknown outside. Hours seemed to pass, each minute stretching long with Jack's growing fear. Then, tapping started, a slow, deliberate rhythm against the car window. Tap, tap, tap. He turned his head toward the sound and saw her again, the woman from the road, tapping against the glass with pale, slender fingers. Jack yelled, scrambling away from the window. "What do you want?" he cried, his voice hoarse with fear. But she just continued tapping, her expression unchanging, her mouth still open in that silent scream. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished into the fog. The car lights flickered back to life, the engine sputtered, and Jack didn't hesitate. He drove as fast as the fog and the winding road would allow, not stopping until he reached the safety of his home. Breathing heavily, Jack ran inside, locking the door behind him. He leaned against it, eyes closed, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, just a story. But when he opened his eyes, there on his living room wall, written in what looked like old, dried blood, were the words, "Do not drive alone at night." Jack's phone rang, jarring him from the shock. Unknown number. He answered with a trembling hand. "Don't forget what you saw," whispered the same soft, static-laced voice from the radio. And the line went dead. After the unsettling phone call, Jack was left in a state of heightened alert, his heart pounding against his chest like a drum in the silence of his own home. He spent the rest of the night pacing, every creak and groan of the house amplifying his anxiety. Sleep was an impossibility. His mind replayed the events on the road and the chilling message scrawled on his wall. By dawn, his fear had mingled with an insatiable curiosity. Who was the woman on the road, and what did she want with him? Jack's day was spent researching. He delved into the history of the highway, unearthing stories of disappearances dating back decades. The stories varied, but one element remained constant: the description of a woman in a pale dress, seen on the foggiest nights, always appearing right before a traveler vanished without a trace. Jack's skepticism waned, replaced by a reluctant acceptance of the supernatural. Yet, he needed answers. He couldn't let the mystery go, not when it had come knocking on his door. As night approached again, a reckless plan formed in his mind. He would go back to the highway. He would find the woman. Jack packed a small bag with essentials: flashlight, camera, and a voice recorder. If he was to face a ghost, he would gather evidence of its existence. The drive back to the old highway was fraught with tension. Each mile marker seemed to taunt him, pulling him deeper into a web he wasn't sure he could escape from. When he arrived at the stretch of road where he had seen her the night before, he parked his car at the roadside, his hands trembling as he turned off the engine. The fog was already rolling in, thick and suffocating, swallowing the weak beams of his headlights. Jack stepped out into the chilly night, the fog clinging to his clothes like a cold embrace. He walked along the road, his flashlight beam piercing the mist in short, rapid sweeps. "Hello," he called into the fog. "I need to speak with you." His voice seemed to be swallowed up by the fog, muffled and directionless. He continued walking, his recorder on, hoping to catch any sound, any clue. That's when he heard it, a soft sobbing, echoing faintly through the fog. Jack followed the sound, his heart pounding in his ears. The sobbing grew louder, more distinct. He found her sitting on the roadside, her head in her hands, her long pale hair cascading over her face. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice soft, trying to mask his fear. She looked up, her face ghostly pale, her eyes dark voids in the fog. "I am lost," she whispered, her voice a chilling blend of grief and menace. "And so are you." "Why am I lost?" Jack managed to say, though his voice shook. "You will see," she replied, standing slowly. She pointed down the road, towards a part of the highway that was swallowed by the dense fog. "Go there, and you will understand everything." Despite every instinct screaming for him to run, Jack's need for answers drove him forward. He walked where she pointed, the fog growing so thick that he could barely see his feet. The air grew colder, and the silence was oppressive, suffocating. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it were moving. Jack stopped, shining his flashlight around. He was no longer on the road but standing at the edge of an old, overgrown cemetery that wasn't supposed to be there. The graves, old and decrepit, bore names that faded into obscurity, forgotten by time. His flashlight landed on a tombstone that made his blood run cold. It bore his own name, with today's date etched as the date of death. He staggered back, gasping for air, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sick hallucination. But the cold touch of the fog, the undeniable solidity of the tombstone under his fingertips, it all felt dreadfully, horribly real. A laughter broke through the silence, not the woman's, but a deeper, menacing chuckle that seemed to come from the ground itself. "Do you understand now, Jack?" the voice boomed through the fog. Jack turned to run, but the fog seemed to turn into walls, trapping him with the graves. The laughter grew louder, echoing around him in a frenzied cacophony. He was alone, yet surrounded. Lost, yet exactly where something wanted him to be. And as the night stretched endlessly, the fog seemed to whisper secrets, dark and ancient, revealing truths that Jack had never wanted to uncover. End of part 2. The laughter swirled around Jack, a sound thick with malice and darkness. His flashlight flickered as if the very air drained its power. Each beam of light seemed to struggle against the smothering fog, revealing glimpses of crumbling tombstones and gnarled trees whose branches reached out like twisted hands. As Jack stumbled through the cemetery, his mind raced, trying to piece together the nightmare unfolding around him. He recalled the artifacts in his trunk, the stories of curses and hauntings they carried. Had he unwittingly invited this horror into his life? The air grew colder, the fog denser, and his sense of direction faltered under the weight of his fear. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way slightly. He looked down to see he had stepped on a freshly dug grave, the earth loose and unsettled. The sight sent a fresh wave of terror through him. His name on a tombstone was one thing, a grave prepared for him was quite another. He backed away hurriedly, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Who are you?" he shouted into the fog, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" No answer came, only the whisper of the wind through the dead leaves. Jack turned his recorder on again, hoping to capture any sounds or voices that might give him a clue to what was happening. He continued to make his way through the cemetery, his flashlight now his only lifeline in the oppressive darkness. As he moved, shadows seemed to shift and stir at the corners of his vision. Figures, indistinct and blurry, appeared and disappeared with each sweep of light, always just out of clear sight, but unmistakably human in shape. A low murmur began to fill the air, voices overlapping, none distinct enough to understand. The cacophony built as Jack approached the center of the cemetery, where an ancient mausoleum stood. The structure loomed large and foreboding, its stone doors ajar, inviting, or daring, him to enter. The voices grew louder, urging him forward. With every step, Jack felt the pull of the unseen, the unknown, drawing him in. He paused at the entrance, his heart pounding in his ears. The air here was colder, if that were possible, and the darkness within the mausoleum seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He raised his flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness, and took a tentative step inside. The interior was cloaked in shadows, but the walls were lined with niches, each holding an urn or a decrepit bouquet of long-dead flowers. In the center of the room lay a stone sarcophagus, its lid adorned with carvings of angels and demons locked in an eternal struggle. As Jack approached the sarcophagus, the murmuring voices crescendoed into a clear, piercing chant. The words were in a language he didn't understand, but their intent felt unmistakably sinister. He reached out a trembling hand towards the lid of the sarcophagus, compelled by a force he could neither explain nor resist. The moment his fingers touched the cold stone, the air shifted. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep silence that seemed to echo with the heartbeat of the earth itself. The darkness deepened, coalescing into a figure that rose from behind the sarcophagus. It was her, the woman from the road, her eyes now glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. "You have come," she whispered, her voice echoing off the stone walls, filling the space with a chilling resonance. "Now you will know." The ground trembled, and the air thickened, as if reality itself was warping around him. Images flashed before Jack's eyes, visions of other travelers on the road, their faces twisted in fear, scenes of rituals and sacrifices, dark and ancient, glimpses of his own life, interwoven with threads of fates he could not comprehend. He tried to speak, to ask her what she meant, but his voice was lost in the swell of dark energy that filled the mausoleum. The woman moved closer, her form blurring between that of a human and something else, something older and far more terrifying. As she reached out to him, her fingers inches from his face, the visions intensified, a torrent of images and sensations that threatened to overwhelm his mind. The spectral fingers never touched him, yet the brush of her presence was like ice on his skin. Jack reeled back, the force of the visions pushing him physically away from the woman. Each image that flashed before him was more vivid than the last, whispers of lost souls, cries of anguish, and the constant, ever-present fog. "Stop," Jack gasped, clutching at his head as if he could physically tear the visions from his mind. but the spectral woman merely tilted her head, watching him struggle with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "You cannot flee from what is already part of you," she said, her voice a haunting melody that resonated with the walls of the mausoleum. "You sought answers. Now you must accept them." Jack's eyes darted around, looking for any escape. But the mausoleum seemed to close in around him, the shadows stretching and twisting into bars of a cage. His breathing became labored, each breath a sharp dagger in his chest as the air thickened. "Why me?" he choked out, the question a desperate plea more than a demand for answers. "You carry the mark," she replied, pointing towards his back where the diary from the Salem witch trials lay. "Your fate was sealed with the curiosity that drew you to these cursed items. You disturbed the rest of the past, and now it clings to you." The realization struck Jack like a blow. His fascination with the macabre, his collection of haunted and cursed artifacts, it had all led him here, to a destiny he could never have imagined. A part of him wanted to deny it, to run and forget everything he had seen and heard. But another part, the part that had always driven him to seek out these dark treasures, wanted to delve deeper, to understand. He took a deep, steadying breath and faced the woman. "What happens now?" She smiled, a gesture not of warmth, but of inevitability. "You learn, you see, you survive, if you can. The road you've chosen is long and perilous. Tonight is but a step." The ground beneath them began to rumble, a low vibration that grew into a cacophonous roar. The mausoleum shook, dust and small stones falling from the ancient ceiling. The woman's form began to fade, dissolving into the thickening fog that seeped into the room. "Remember," her voice echoed around him as she disappeared, "you are not alone, but you must wish you were." As her image vanished completely, the tremors subsided, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. Jack was left alone in the silence of the mausoleum, the echoes of her words ringing in his ears. He felt a change within himself, a deepening of the connection to the otherworldly energies he had always sought to understand but had never truly believed in until now. Determined to find more answers, Jack gathered his courage and his tools. He switched on his voice recorder once more, setting it to capture any sounds or whispers that might guide him further. He then stepped cautiously out of the mausoleum, his flashlight cutting through the darkness and fog that seemed less intimidating now, almost familiar. The cemetery was quiet, the previous visions of phantoms and whispers gone as if they had never been. Jack walked through the maze of tombstones, each step more confident than the last. He was no longer just a collector of the macabre, he was a part of the story now, a player in a game as old as time. As he reached the boundary of the cemetery, he looked back one last time. The fog was lifting, revealing the path back to his car, back to the world he knew. But Jack knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He was marked, changed, bound to a journey that had only just begun. He got into his car, the engine starting with a reassuring purr. The road home was still shrouded in fog, but it didn't seem menacing anymore. It was a veil, a thin barrier between what most people believed was real and what he had just experienced. As he drove, his mind raced with possibilities, with questions, with a fear that was tinged with excitement. What lay ahead was unknown, but for the first time, Jack felt ready to face whatever the shadows held. The drive home was long and contemplative for Jack. The road stretched out before him, no longer just a pathway lined with asphalt and trees, but a metaphor for the journey he had unknowingly embarked upon. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, Jack felt a strange peace settle over him. The fear that had gripped him so tightly was now accompanied by a resolve to face whatever awaited him in the shadows of the unknown. Upon returning home, Jack went straight to his study, where his collection of cursed and haunted artifacts was displayed. Each item seemed to pulsate with a newfound energy, as if welcoming him back from his ordeal with a silent acknowledgement of his deeper understanding. He sat at his desk, pulling the 17th century diary towards him. The diary that had started it all. With cautious reverence, he opened it, his eyes scanning the ancient, faded writing. The entry spoke of rituals and spirits, of the thin veil between worlds that could be manipulated by those who knew the ancient secrets. It mentioned a lineage of guardians and seekers, individuals who were drawn to the supernatural, tasked with maintaining the balance between light and dark. As Jack read, a realization dawned upon him. His obsession with the macabre was not merely a personal eccentricity. It was a calling, a duty inherited from a long line of seekers before him. This newfound knowledge was both a burden and a gift. Jack knew that his life would never be the same. There would be dangers, certainly, more nights filled with the terror he had experienced on the old highway. But there would also be wonders and mysteries that few were privileged to witness. He was part of a story much larger than himself, a story that spanned centuries. With this understanding, Jack decided that he needed to learn more, to prepare himself for what was to come. He began to document everything, recording his experiences and findings meticulously. He reached out to other collectors and experts in the occult, seeking their knowledge and sharing his own. His collection grew, not just as curiosities, but as tools and talismans. Days turned into weeks, and Jack's life became a balance between his normal day-to-day activities and his nocturnal explorations into the supernatural. He encountered spirits, some benign and others malevolent. He learned to protect himself, using the artifacts and knowledge he had acquired. His reputation in certain circles grew, and he became known as a mediator between the earthly and the ethereal. One evening, as Jack was poring over an old map of ley lines and haunted locations, a knock came at his door. He answered it to find a young woman, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. She introduced herself as Eliza, a student of parapsychology who had heard of his exploits. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "It's my brother. He's been taken by something. Something from the other side." Jack listened as Eliza recounted her story. Her brother, an amateur ghost hunter, had gone missing during an investigation at an old abandoned sanatorium known for its violent spectral activity. The police had been dismissive, attributing his disappearance to an accident or foul play, but Eliza was convinced it was something supernatural. As Eliza spoke, Jack felt the familiar stir of adventure and duty. Here was a chance to use his skills to help someone else touched by the supernatural world he had become so deeply entwined with. He agreed to help her, knowing this could be one of his most dangerous encounters yet. But he was ready. He had to be. "Let's prepare," Jack said, his voice firm with resolve. "We leave at dawn. This is just the beginning." As they set to work, the night outside grew deeper, the shadows in Jack's study lengthening. But the darkness was no longer oppressive. It was expectant, almost alive with possibilities. Jack and Eliza worked through the night, unaware of the eyes that watched them from the darkness, eyes that gleamed with an otherworldly light. As dawn painted the sky in hues of grey and lavender, Jack and Eliza set out for the abandoned sanatorium. The building loomed before them, a hulking mass of decayed stone and broken windows that seemed to swallow the light around it. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, and even Jack, seasoned as he was, felt a chill crawl up his spine as they approached. They entered through a creaky, rusted gate, the iron groaning under its own weight. Inside, the sanatorium was a maze of corridors and rooms, each filled with remnants of its dark past. The air was cold and stale, each breath a reminder of the desolation that had seeped into the very walls. As they moved deeper into the building, Jack's equipment began to act up. His EMF meter spiked erratically, and his flashlight flickered as if struggling against an unseen force. Eliza clung to his arm, her eyes wide with fear but determined. Jack could see the strength in her, fueled by her desperation to find her brother. They reached the heart of the sanatorium, where the energy was so thick it was almost visible like a mist hovering in the air. "He was here," Eliza whispered, pointing to a room down the hall. Its door was slightly ajar, and as they approached, a low moan echoed from within, chilling them to the bone. Jack pushed the door open, revealing a room that seemed untouched by time. Medical equipment stood as if ready for use, and in the center, a gurney. Upon it lay a figure, shrouded in shadow. As they stepped closer, the figure stirred, and the moan turned into a clear, pained cry. "It's him!" Eliza gasped, rushing forward. But Jack caught her arm, pulling her back just as the figure sat up. It was Eliza's brother, but his eyes were hollow, his skin pallid and cold to the touch. "What happened to you?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the horror that unfolded before him. "He called to me," her brother rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The master of this place. He feeds on the living." Jack understood then. The sanatorium was a beacon for something ancient and malevolent, a creature that thrived in the shadows of human despair. It had lured Eliza's brother here, trapping him in its grip. "We need to get him out," Jack said firmly, stepping forward to lift Eliza's brother. But as he did, the shadows in the room grew denser, coalescing into the form of a tall, dark figure. Its eyes gleamed red in the dim light, and its presence sent a wave of terror so intense it was almost physical. "You cannot take what is mine," it boomed, its voice echoing through the halls. Jack held up a crucifix, one of the artifacts from his collection, imbued with protective powers. "We're leaving, and you cannot stop us," he declared, his voice resonant with the authority of someone who had faced the darkness before and prevailed. The creature hissed, recoiling as Jack approached. With Eliza helping her brother, they made their way out of the room, the creature following, a mass of shadow snapping at their heels. But Jack's crucifix blazed with a light so pure it seemed to clear a path for them. They reached the outside, the morning sun cresting over the horizon, its light banishing the remnants of the night's terror. The creature did not follow into the light, it was bound to the darkness of the sanatorium. Eliza's brother was safe, but weakened, forever changed by his ordeal. They knew he would need time and care to recover from the trauma. As they drove away, the sanatorium shrinking in the rearview mirror, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Yet, the encounter had left a mark on him, a deeper understanding of the darkness that lurked just beyond the veil of the ordinary world. Jack looked over at Eliza, her face bathed in the morning light, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. He knew this was only one of many battles he would face. The road ahead was long, filled with unknowns, but Jack Sullivan was ready. He had found his calling, and he would meet it head-on, a guardian standing firm against the shadows.